del principio de que esa guerra se convertía en guerra nuclear y que de todas maneras íbamos a desaparecer antes que el país fuese ocupado totalmente, dispuestos a morir en la defensa del país. Yo sí habría estado de acuerdo en si se produce esa invasión de que se habla, en el empleo de las armas nucleares tácticas.
I didn't know there were tactical nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba then. I didn't know that if we carried out an attack, there was a 100% probability of a nuclear exchange. Had we carried out that attack, there would have been nuclear war. And where would it have ended? Who can say?
Kennedy resisted the pressure of the military to invade Cuba that day. Without knowing it, he saved the world from nuclear war.
Indeed, he did. Whew, everybody take a deep breath. Any questions, Rick? Chime in there, buddy.
No, I'm just nervous because
Yeah, me too.
I see where we're at today, and we see how close we came then. And I've been saying it on the show for, well, months.
Since it started back in February.
Yep.
Because there's always that danger when you're dealing with a nuclear power.
And with the media behaving the way they are, they're downplaying it because they want to keep the money flowing. You can't talk about nuclear war and scare the hell out of the people.
And they want to get Joe Biden reelected.
That too, right? And
don't freak out.
Yeah, and you just you're not going to you're going to lose the public support for the war and for the funding if you start scaring them.
So here's my question: if Kennedy could negotiate a way out of this thing, which he did, with everybody against him, okay, except for maybe his brother and George Ball, and that was about it at the end, then why can't we negotiate a way out of this? Today, I mean, it's, Putin threw out, I think, 2 peace plans, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. Okay. And according to their sources, they were ready to negotiate this, but Boris Johnson is a guy who kind of blew up those negotiations. Okay. Why he would do that. And by the way, the guy's not even prime minister of England anymore. So, but neither is Liz Truss, as a matter of fact, why that would have any weight today is very, very strange to me. I believe that this is sort of like what happened in Afghanistan. Okay. If you remember, Carter's national security advisor,
Brzezinski?
Yeah. He said, we can give Russia their Vietnam. Okay. In Afghanistan, completely overlooking the fact that, well, won't you be a boon to Islamic terrorists? If that's who you're going to recruit to fight the Russians, Okay. So I think there's an element of that in what's going on in Ukraine.
Let me ask you this. Do you think we are at our Black Saturday, our October 27th? Are we at that point at this moment where Kennedy was 60 years ago this week? Are things that tense, Jim?
I don't think they're that bad. Okay. Although one could argue that because nuclear weapons are so much more sophisticated now, they're so much more advanced, it doesn't matter if they're 90 miles away or 5,000 miles away. I guess you could make that argument. Okay. But, is it really, is what's going on there in Ukraine? I mean, is it really worth, turning everything to dust? I sure as hell don't think so.
Right. And I'm sure people in 1962 probably thought the same thing. Are we going to blow up the world over Cuba? That's this little bitty island. Who cares? If they want to be communists, so what? So let's just let them, leave them alone. But of course, the Pentagon and the CIA just was obsessed with Cuba. They could not leave it alone, just like they're obsessed with Ukraine today. It's their pivot point for World War III. It's, it's ground zero. So I wanted to play for you something that brought a sigh of relief to everyone around the world, everyone here in the United States, certainly. This is the morning of October 28th. And this is just a radio report. There's no video. This is a bulletin that went out over NBC radio network directly from Moscow. Hopefully you
are tuned to Radio Moscow. In addition to instructions earlier transmitted to stop construction work on installations in Cuba, the Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
That was Radio Moscow at 9 o'clock this morning. Mr. Khrushchev crating up his missiles and shipping them home. Rarely has any week in history ended in such an unexpected climax. We will have a look at that week. This is Ray Scherer, NBC News, Washington.
And this is NBC News, presenting today an NBC News special, Crisis in Cuba, 7th day. Now, here is NBC News White House correspondent, Ray Scherer.
This is the week, these 7 days that shook the world. The United States almost went to nuclear war. Perhaps no one will ever know how close it came except for Nikita Khrushchev, who apparently had no illusions. The feeling in official Washington after one of the most frightening weeks in history is that it's too early for elation, but not too early to wonder what happened and why it happened. Moscow's course in the last 48 hours has seemed contradictory and zigzag, as if the Kremlin were having a great private debate. The I's are not dotted and the T's are not crossed, but everything seems easier. The mood here is still caution spelled with a capital C. Khrushchev is offered to remove his missiles from Cuba. If he does, we will call off the quarantine and there will be no invasion. The president today calls Khrushchev's decision statesmanlike. Has the United States made a deal with Moscow? The answer is no. What then is in this for Khrushchev? There will be no armed showdown. There will be no nuclear war. The Cuban problem will still be there for us, but Castro now stands before the world as the expendable man. Now to the news of the moment. First to White House correspondent Sander Van Oker at the White House.
This is Sander Van Oker, NBC News, reporting from the White House, where in just about a minute or two, reporters will be going into new Secretary Pierre Salinger's office to get the text of President Kennedy's latest letter to Premier Khrushchev. It's the letter that's expected to outline the details on the dismantling and the transfer of offensive weapons in Cuba. And now for the situation at the Defense Department, here's Peter Hackus at the Pentagon.
In brief, Ray, we're still taking aerial photos. We've seen no sign thus far that the Russians have stopped building those missile sites, and our military activity, including the blockade, is still on in full force. Until there's evidence that work has stopped and that the dismantling has begun, that's the way it will continue. Now, here's Ellie Abel, NBC State Department correspondent.
Secretary of State Rusk is prepared to go to New York to take personal charge of the negotiations with Russia's Kuznetsov and Uthan. The administration is taking nothing for granted at this moment. Reaching agreement on the fine print may be tricky, but there is hope now for political solutions through diplomacy, thanks to the president's show of determination backed by force. Now to Pauline Frederick, NBC News at the United Nations.
Secretary General Font has just accepted Cuban Premier Castro's invitation to go to Havana to discuss the crisis. Font leaves on Tuesday. He will take a staff with him, leaving some of the members behind when he returns to New York. Meanwhile, he is continuing his round of conferences here. He sees Soviet delegate Zorin in half an hour. For reaction in Moscow, here is NBC's Don Connery.
The Russian people have just heard the astonishing news on radio and television of major Soviet concessions to the United States. Today's decision, unquestionably, will be welcomed by the great mass of Russian people who have been fearful of war over Cuba, a war which the Soviet Union seems less ready to engage in than the United States.
Let that sink in. Do you hear what he just said? The Moscow correspondent? Did you guys hear that? He said, this is a war the Soviets would be less likely to want to engage in than the United States.
Yes. Well, it's probably true. Okay. What's happened here, I think, is that this is a reaction to Bobby Kennedy's nighttime visit to Anatoly Dobrynin.
Yes.
All right. In which he essentially says two things. All right. First of all, that we agree on the pledge and we agree on the Jupiter missiles, but the Jupiter missiles will not come out for about 6 months. All right. Because we want to try and disguise the cause and effect relationship. But then he went even further. And I believe this is what provoked Khrushchev and the Moscow radio to say what they did. And by the way, Bobby did not include this in his book, but Dobrynin did include it in the message to Moscow. He said, the president is not sure how long he can hold off the Joint Chiefs and his more militant cabinet advisors. All right. That there even might be an attempt, to take over the government if this is not solved very soon. All right. And by the way, that was really a kind of accurate description, because towards the end, like October 23rd, 24th, Kennedy's essentially kind of alone. That's why I think he sent his brother on this secret mission to Anatoly Dobrynin to get the message to Moscow.
And do you think that's because his brother was the only person he felt he could trust?
At this moment in time, and with the XCOM the way it was, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Me too.
The only other guy I could even think of is George Ball.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But you would have run the risk of George Ball saying something, where he could implicitly trust his brother. All right. And so this is the beginning of the ending of the crisis. And by the way, Castro would not let anybody into Cuba. Right. He was so angry at Khrushchev for cutting him out at the last minute negotiations that he did not let any observers into Cuba. And so what they did is they monitored it with a combination of the U-2 flights plus the quarantine. All the Russian ships coming out of Cuba were boarded by Americans, okay, to check on exactly what they had. And they made an inventory, okay, of what was coming out in each ship to make sure that it complied with the information that they had about what was actually there. All right. And this included the IL-28s, the atomic bombers that were coming out. Okay. Castro really didn't want those things to leave, but, right. Kennedy insisted on it. Okay. And those came out a few weeks later. Now, I was telling Rick, the irony in this resolution of the crisis is that Castro sent word through James Donovan, who was negotiating, a New York lawyer, who was negotiating the Bay of Pigs prisoners release, that he would be open to talking to Kennedy about a rapprochement. I think this was a result of, number one, Khrushchev dumping him over the side, and second, realizing how close Cuba had come to being, essentially
wiped off the face of the earth.
Right, essentially gone from any future geography books. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the reason that he decided to make this approach through James Donovan about a rapprochement, which Kennedy, by the way, was all for.
Oh, yeah. And when we heard that clip from Radio Moscow, and that was when the Soviet people heard, oh, it's all over. Whew. But, the Soviet people were relieved, but they were also pretty humiliated and angry. And they saw this as their leader, Khrushchev, showing weakness to the United States. And in fact, it was the Cuba situation that would lead to Khrushchev's downfall as the leader of the Soviet Union. Could you tell us, fairly quickly about what happened to Nikita Khrushchev after this?
Well, see, Khrushchev had these designs with Kennedy about a détente, and they did achieve it. They got for example, they got the partial nuclear test ban treaty through, and then they got the hotline from Washington to Moscow, so they could directly communicate without going through telegrams. All right, and he was banking on this. Okay, and then of course, whoever killed Kennedy kind of blew it for him, and by 1964, the hardliners were essentially attacking him because they felt, as you just said, that Russia had retreated, like a whimpering dog, okay, out of Cuba. And they called it, and there was some justice to this. If you read the debate in the Kremlin, they called it a harebrained scheme, okay, which even frightened the wits out of Nikita Khrushchev, who devised the whole thing. And so by 1964, look at it this way. In 63, you have Kennedy assassinated. In 64, you have Khrushchev being dumped.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess they basically impeached him, or whatever the Soviet equivalent of impeachment is, but they had him removed from power.
A vote of no confidence. Yeah.
I see.
Okay. But you know what Khrushchev said about that? That's really kind of funny you brought that up. He goes, the fact that I'm being retired to a Dachau tells you all the progress I made. Because if this would have been under Stalin, I would just be taken out and killed. Okay.
That's true. That is so true. So as we connect these two events, the last time we stood this close to the edge of nuclear war in 1962 and today, I just want to play you, to kind of wrap up this segment, words from the men who were there, who were involved in the negotiations in this crisis, their advice on how we can make sure it never happens again. I think the whole world, and especially our leaders, really need to hear this right now. Let me give you a few minutes of this.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the superpowers have ever come to nuclear war. Over the ensuing months and years, the key players have analyzed its causes and its course.
I think looking back in Cuba, what is of concern is the fact that both governments were so far out of contact, really. I don't think that we expected that he would put the missiles in Cuba, because it would have seemed such an imprudent action for him to take, as it was later proved. Now, he obviously must have thought he could do it in secret, and that the United States would accept it, so that he did not judge our intentions accurately. Well, now, if you look at the history of this century, where World War I really came through a series of misjudgments of the intentions of others, certainly World War II, and you look at all those misjudgments which brought on war, and then you see the Soviet Union and the United States so far separated in their beliefs, and you put the nuclear equation into that struggle. That's what makes this, as I said before, such a dangerous time, and that we must proceed with the firmness and also with the best information we can get, and also with care.
That same month, at his villa on the Black Sea, Khrushchev revealed his feelings about the Cuban Missile Crisis to the editor of Saturday Review magazine, Norman Cousins.
Khrushchev was very somber as he spoke about it. He said that I get nightmares when I think how close we came. And suddenly he said, I had this terrible responsibility. Was I going to try to, out of pride, just to demonstrate to the world that the Soviet Union could stand up to the United States? Was that decision going to result in the destruction of my country and your country? He said it was insanity.
Well, there are lots of lessons in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but if I had to pick out...
Many of the participants in the Cuban Missile Crisis have reflected on the lessons they learned in 1962. It is clear that nuclear weapons do not lend themselves to brinksmanship.
The avoidance of a situation in which the game takes control is of enormous importance in any situation which has a risk of direct conflict.
Give your opponent an out. Look at the crisis from his point of view. I don't mean to say be weak. That's not my point at all. But my point is, look at the crisis from his point of view. Look at the options that you are considering from his point of view. Try to pick an option that achieves your purpose at minimal cost to him, political, military, otherwise to him, that avoids pushing him into an emotional frame of mind in which he is likely to lash out irrationally with great cost to him and you.
If the United States lacks security, it will be dangerous both for us and for the United States. The same thing is true if you put things vice versa.
I think the primary lesson that we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I hope it's learned on both sides, is that we must try our best to prevent such crises from arriving on the scene because they're just too utterly dangerous. You see, we and the Russians should not play games of chicken with each other to see how far one might go in a particular adventure without crossing that lethal line into nuclear war.
In Havana, Cuba, there is a curious memorial to the crisis, the empty shell of a ballistic missile. Last January, a number of participants and students of the crisis gathered here, including Robert McNamara, Soviet Ambassador Alexander Alexeyev, and the son of Nikita Khrushchev. During the conference, it became clear just how imperfect their understanding of the situation had been, and how big a part chance had played. As the former enemies posed for a photograph, the irony was inescapable. The world has changed dramatically since 1962, but it was not changed with weapons.
So there you have it. The world was not changed by weapons. It was changed by diplomacy.
Well, that's a good lesson to learn. Okay. And I think, you know, what all the people who have studied this, you know, have a lot of admiration for what Kennedy did. All right. Which was kind of bold, you know, and as McNamara said, the important thing was to give the other side a way out, okay, you know, without humiliating them, you know, and so I think that's what Kennedy, you know, was trying to do.
And he was very clear too, when the Soviets finally blinked, he was very clear both to his cabinet, his advisors, and even the press that this is not a time to gloat.
Yes.
You know, or say, hey, we won, you know, that he didn't want to handle it like that at all.
He wouldn't go on TV. They wanted him to go on television because this to them was, they thought this was a great victory, and Kennedy wouldn't do it.
Right.
Okay. You know, and instead what happens, of course, is that once he gets the word from James Donovan, he sets up this back channel with Lisa Howard, William Atwood, and John Daniel, okay, negotiating with Castro to find a way to get a rapprochement between the two countries. And I don't have to tell you this. What happens is that Daniel is the last guy in the chain. He sends this long message to Castro, okay, about how I understand what Batista did to your country. I understand why you took up arms, okay? And I am totally in agreement that that was the right thing to do at that time. You know, all I ask of you is that you don't become a strategic base for the Soviet Union to spread, you know, Marxist communism into South America, all right? And so when he heard this speech, Castro was stupefied. He couldn't believe it. Oh my God, am I really an American president saying this to me? You know, so he was just in jubilation about it. Okay. And then when him and Danielle go out in Havana, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, they bring a phone over to Castro at this lunch table, and and Castro's listening to it. His mouth falls, and he says, "This is bad news." He says it 3 times. Okay, he says Kennedy's been shot. All right, and then about 20 minutes later, they bring the phone out to him again, and he get that Kennedy's dead, and he tells Danielle right at that instant. He didn't even think about it. He says, everything is going to change. Everything will change from here on in, you know. And he was exactly right, because that was the end of the back channel. And by the way, this is what now, 60 years, and we still don't have relations with Cuba.
Yeah, I wonder if that hotline is still there and if anybody's used it in a little while.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. The relationship with Russia has gotten, you know, progressively worse and worse and worse. I believe.
Yeah, from where we were at that video we just saw.
Yes.
That was from 1992. It was just after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was this cooperation between the superpowers for the first time in half a century.
Look, let me tell you a little
Look how
story
far
about
we've
this.
drifted.